You've been lied to, and this tuner does nothing when it comes to tuning the orchestra. And I'll tell you why. What's up, guys? Welcome to Zeke's Oboe's very first podcast. This is episode number 1, Why You've Been Lied To, and the real reason why the oboe tunes the orchestra. So we're going to be unpacking that today, but before we dive into that, I'm going to tell you a little bit of story and history of my experience playing the oboe and why this is an important topic to me. So going back in time, this is me in 5th grade. I started off with the clarinet, and it went great up until the end of my 5th grade year where I was like, I want to switch. But of course, my parents wouldn't let me quit. So I did band another year. So now it's my 6th grade year. And somewhere through the grapevine, because my dad talked to the band directors and told them I wanted to play oboe, they gave me the chance to play oboe. But of course, this wasn't until the end of the 6th grade year. So after 2 years of clarinet, I now finally get a chance to play the oboe. This moment where it's like, I love music. And that's when I really wanted to pursue oboe. I mean, of course, I didn't really know I wanted to do that back then, but it was one of those aha moments in my life. And it was really fascinating. Of course, a year later, I found out I'd have to tune the band and the orchestra. And they didn't tell me that when I was first starting off on the oboe. Otherwise, maybe I would have quit. But besides that, yeah, it was just a really cool experience. And I'm glad I was able to learn 2 instruments by the time everyone else, I guess, started off on 1 instrument and just perfected that. But I was able to learn 2. So that's a really cool thing. But why the oboe and why tuning? Why should we even worry about tuning the instrument or even tuning instruments in general? It's just an interesting, fascinating, I guess you could call it nostalgic, in the fact that we could just pick up an instrument, play it wrong, and it would be good. But we know intonation needs some sort of tonal center so that way everyone can stay in tune together and be a collective body of musicians. And of course, later on, you work on that. And the next year, my 6th grade year, I picked up the oboe and learned that, hey, in a couple of years, you're going to have to tune the band. But why do I have to tune the band? Why the oboe? Why not a cornet? Why not a trumpet? Why not a clarinet? You know, all these other instruments have an equal role in the orchestra, but specifically the oboe has a special role. And that was something that if I would have known that, maybe I wouldn't have picked the oboe. But nonetheless, it is interesting that back then it's not as important. And I'm going to relate this to what I'll tell you about in a little bit later. But the reason that we don't have to worry about intonation back then is somewhat important, but not that important to my next point. So, of course, once you get to high school, usually by then, everyone's been playing their instruments for multiple years. Some have like at least 5 years of experience. You have to start making music at this point. You're going to have to start being in tune. You're going to have to start collaborating and actually playing your instrument to a high level. But the oboe has an even higher level, being the mantle. And the reason intonation doesn't matter is because I know other oboists who have not used it in a concert to tune an orchestra. So I'm not saying we like never use it, but I've seen oboes in the middle of like a movement or a piece. They're either too lazy or it's like too stressful to get their tuner and like tune in the short amount of time that you have. So I saw one girl literally pick up her instrument, and she also was playing English horn. So she had like 2 seconds to like soak her reed of the English horn and then get her oboe ready to tune everyone. Just starts playing an A. And I swear it's like, okay, if this was out of tune, the whole orchestra and band's going to be out of tune because this girl's just playing a random note. There's some value to this. The fact that you can just play a note and everyone else matches to it is pretty important, because intonation is all about everyone, the collective body, being in tune. So it doesn't really matter the pitch. We started coming up with like ideas for what is the tonal center and what we should shoot for, like how many hertz an A should be, versus back then A's were all over the place. You can have an A at 410 to 430 to all over that range and above. But we don't necessarily need to follow that system. Of course, nowadays it is so integrated into what we do that if you don't follow it, you're going to be the one out of tune. But if everyone just adjusted to you, like they did when oboes, like that one time that one girl played an A and everyone just matched it, but she already had good tonal pitch. But if she wasn't in tune and everyone just adjusted to it, you can play at any pitch, really. So intonation and the tuner is only relevant if you're trying to hit one specific hertz. History isn't so strict in that sense. And there's an article that I found, and I'm going to read a little bit to you guys so that way we can learn the truth. But I will debunk a few myths before we dive into that, because there's a lot of you that have been told either by your band director or someone who just doesn't really know why the oboe tunes the orchestra. And some of the times I hear the oboe tunes the orchestra because of their reeds. The reeds just hard to manipulate, and they're easy to go out of tune, and you got to get a good reed so that the oboe can be in tune, and then that's easier for them so that everyone else can match to them. And that's why when you have situations like that one girl who just picks up an instrument and plays it and everyone else matches to her, the whole orchestra works. And it wouldn't work if it was a different instrument. Bassoons also have a double reed that they have to adjust. So why don't we tune to the bassoon? So that right there isn't true. And the other thing I've heard is that oboes just have a loud sound. When they play, everyone can hear them, and it just makes sense for them to be the mantle of the tuning and intonation. But isn't a trumpet louder? So when I was hearing all these different ideas of why the oboe tunes versus the real reason for why it tunes, I was like, it just doesn't make sense for what we've been told from our teachers and peers, because that's just not true. Logically, it doesn't make sense. So I had to do a little bit more digging to uncover that truth. So I'm going to pull up a little bit. I'm going to read a little bit to you guys, and I'm going to include the link to the article that I'm referring to in the description. But yeah, there's a lot of history that is involved in this. So let's start. But it wasn't the oboe who set the center pitch in the early days. Up to the late 16th century, most sacred music was vocal, so the instruments, organs mainly, were built to suit the range of the human voice, hence lower. However, when secular instruments such as violin and cornet were introduced into service, tuning became an issue, as sacred pitch differed from opera pitch, chamber music pitch, and military pitch, with heavy local variation. Composers of early 17th to 18th century were commonly notating music in more than one key, on a need-to basis to overcome regional and instrumental differences. So the idea of that, like I mentioned before, pitch can fluctuate from region to region, and back then it changed all the time. It didn't matter what pitch you were playing at as long as everyone else in your region played at the same pitch. And so later on in history, there's even a point where Rossini got mad because people were playing his piece a semitone flat because it was a regional thing. They just played flat. And although he may disagree that it was wrong, I would argue that it's okay as long as the collective is still working together, because ultimately music is communal and you do need groups to help work together to create music, especially for larger pieces like operas and symphonies. The reason the oboe tunes the orchestra goes much deeper to the fact that their instrument isn't special. I mean, it is special in my opinion because I'm biased, but isn't so special that it has to be them. The real reason why the oboe tunes the orchestra is because of history. And I know that's kind of like, oh, well, I could have figured that out. But no. It's just plain history and why the oboe tunes the orchestra. It's more of a traditional thing because you go from one period of time to another period of time and they just keep referring to the oboe and the oboe. And it's kind of messy in the beginning because you'll see if you read this, like the 16th century, 17th century, it's kind of like messy. They don't really know when the oboe started tuning the orchestra. And then later on, somewhere the oboe starts tuning the orchestra, and that's what happens. And everyone goes along with it. And I'm going to read another passage to kind of answer some of our questions for why the oboe tunes the orchestra. the history behind it is the fact that there were moments in history where violinists used to use a tuning fork, and they'd hit a tuning fork and they'd hear the note, and then they would just play their strings and match that pitch, and then everyone else would match that pitch. And then, of course, back then, gut strings were known to go out of tune more easily than wind instruments, so wind instruments were chosen to take up that instrumental intonation mantle and tune the orchestra because they were more stable than string instruments during that time, just because gut strings go out of tune really fast. And especially when it's a humid environment and they're playing outside, those instruments are all going to go out of tune. So you had to tune really frequently. And there's a lot that can go into a tuning history and just like the idea of what does it mean to have a performance practice of tuning. Like, should you tune before the orchestra walks on stage, during, after? Some have argued that it should only be done outside of the concert hall in order to help set the mood for what a performance needs to be. And I really think it's more of the fact that you just need to be willing to embrace the authenticity of a musician's character, and tuning kind of breaks that tense vibe of limiting what a hearer is going to hear before they actually hear the performance. Kind of just alleviates any, I guess, sudden nerves, and just like, you know, kind of loosens up the environment. I would say that it loosens up the environment and is very nice. There's a lot that can go on, and I was going to read one more thing before I end. So after Lassus began to incorporate string instruments into sacred services for the Bavarian court in Munich around 1569, other instruments started to trickle into the church, and the limited flexibility of woodwind instruments often determined the pitch setting. Sackbuts were employed in sacred services in Emden, in the 1570s. In Hamburg was regularly using cornets. So cornets were actually used before the oboe. And that's one of the things I wanted to point out. These trumpets also had this mantle that they were able to do. And they were just relatively, I guess, more of a newer instrument during that time, and kind of like a fun sound and loud. Trumpets were actually used too. So it really proves that any instrument can do this. Okay, after Lassus began to incorporate string instruments into sacred services for the Bavarian court in Munich around 1569, other instruments started to trickle into the church, and the limited flexibility of woodwind instruments often determined the pitch setting. Sackbuts were employed in sacred services in Emden in 1570s, and in Hamburg was regularly using cornets by 1590s. The best cornets were made in Venice. So cornets were also used during this time. And somewhere down the line, it got switched to the oboe. I mean, the organs even used it. The key instruments, they even used a pitch pipe. They used a tuning fork. They used all sorts of instruments before the oboe. So what I'm really getting at is tuning can really be anything. You don't need a set hertz to determine what pitch you need to be at. It just depends on your environment and what you want to be at. There's a famous piece that everyone probably knows called Golden Hour by Jake, and that's tuned down hertz. So you can even have modern music that's flat in relative pitch of today's society. That's a flat piece, but it sounds good. And really, intonation needs to be readjusted. We really need to rethink what intonation is. We need to rethink the history and the idea of what we can do when it comes to tuning. And I think this is just like a fascinating idea of kind of bending the rules and the limits of what we can tune to. And when everyone kind of freaks out when you hear like Europe's like at 442 or 445, and they're like, wow, that's really high. It's like, well, how much higher can we go before we say it's too much? Or how low can we go before it's wrong in today's society? And that's really what I want to leave you guys with. What do you guys think we should do when it comes to tuning in today's society? And what areas do you think we should challenge that? Like, should we do chamber works in a flatter pitch? Should we try to get soloists to play flatter and try to have everyone tune to them? Of course, that's hard to do now because Usually the soloist is already tuned before they walk on. Sometimes they get a pitch, sometimes they don't. And then you have the issue of pianos and keyboard instruments. It's like, well, you can't really tune those. But it's like, what if we did tune them higher or flatter? It's just an interesting concept, and I want to know what you guys think. If you have any other thoughts, leave it in the comments down below. But I'm so grateful to have at least shared a part of my life and this idea with you guys for this podcast. Feel free to leave me comments or ideas. All right, guys, peace out.